Before we get started, my name's Raphael, and I created this channel to share science fiction stories, the kind that stick with you even after they end. Everything here is made up, but full of emotion, tough choices, and moments that make you think. So, I'll ask just one small favor. If this kind of story speaks to you, hit that subscribe button. I'm working hard to reach my first 1,000 subscribers, and your vote of confidence really means a lot. And if you've got a second, drop a comment below. Let me know where you're watching from. I love knowing who's out there on the other side. Now take a deep breath. The story's about to begin. They told us the Krell were beaten. They said the sector was secure, that the orbital bombardment had cracked the spine of their logistical network, and that all we had left was the cleanup. But cleanup always meant the same thing. Wading through dust that tasted like ozone and blood, pulling the dead out of the wreckage, and trying to find the flicker of life in the places the plasma fire hadn't sterilized. Sergeant Elias Vance knelt in the central corridor of what used to be a Krell forward armory on Karen Prime. The air was thin and cold, and the only light came from the emergency lamps on his helmet, casting long, distorted shadows of his power armor across the slagged metal walls. The Krell fought ugly, but they built strong. This place hadn't buckled. It had melted, fused into grotesque abstract sculptures of steel and rock. Vance ran a gloved hand across the data pad, confirming the manifest. They were looking for high-grade quantum processors, the kind the Krell used to coordinate their fleet jumps. Deny them that, and they couldn't regroup. Simple, critical work. Anything, Sarge. That was Corporal Reyes, her voice muffled and tight over the comms. She was 20 meters further down, trying to pry open a vault door that looked like it had been kissed by a supernova. Just scrap. And the smell of burnt protein, Vance replied, his voice a low rumble in his helmet. I'm hitting level 3. Command said there was a sub-level maintenance tunnel here. Protocol says, check every hole. Protocol was the only thing holding them together. 3 months on Karen Prime, and they had lost 70% of their original deployment. They were winning, yes, the big picture said they were winning, but every victory felt like a slow, deliberate amputation. Vance had seen enough dead Krell to know they were desperate, cornered animals. They fought until the last molecule of their bodies was ionized. Vance found the access hatch hidden beneath a collapsed ventilation unit. It was small, not designed for Krell physiology, which was all bulk and chitin. This hatch was sleek, almost elegant, suggesting it was either very old or belonged to a different, smaller species. He cycled the magnetic seals. The hatch slid open with a hiss of compressed, stale air. He dropped into the tunnel, the impact muffled by the gravity dampeners on his boots. The air here was different. Less dust, more metallic tang, like old batteries and ozone. He moved slowly, rifle raised. The tunnel led to a small, isolated chamber. It wasn't an armory or a barracks. It looked like a containment cell, or perhaps a medical bay, hastily retrofitted. There was a single, low-power energy field projector humming faintly in the corner, and in the center, huddled against the cold metal wall, was the witness. She wasn't Krell, not even close. The Krell were massive, six-limbed predators, all sharp angles and biological armor. This being was slender, almost frail. Her skin was a pale, shifting blue-gray, reflecting the ambient light like polished quartz. She had 4 delicate limbs and a long, narrow head, dominated by large, intelligent, almond-shaped eyes that were currently wide with terror. Vance froze. His training screamed, identify, assess threat, engage if hostile. But the being was clearly non-combative. She was wearing only tattered scraps of some light fabric, and one of her lower limbs was wrapped crudely in what looked like old insulation foam, soaked dark with dried fluid. She was a captive, not an enemy soldier. He lowered his rifle only slightly, keeping it aimed generally at the floor. Designate, non-Krell, Unknown species. Vance reported softly over the internal channel, bypassing Reyes for a moment. I have a civilian, possibly a captive, deep in the sublevel. Female, injured. Stand by. The being recoiled further into the corner, making a soft, clicking sound that wasn't language, just fear. Vance slowly took 2 steps forward, trying to appear less like a massive armored executioner. He activated the universal translator on his wrist, knowing the chance of a match was near 0. We are human forces, he stated clearly, the translator spitting out a garbled mess of clicks and whistles that sounded nothing like the being's speech. Are you injured? We are here to help. The being shook her head violently, her eyes fixed on his helmet visor. Then she did something unexpected. She didn't beg for help. She tried to communicate an urgent warning. She pushed herself away from the wall, wincing visibly from the injury, and pointed a trembling finger past him, back toward the main levels where Reyes was working. Then she pointed at the wall and used a sharp shard of metal she had hidden in her hand to rapidly score a symbol into the scorched paint. It was a jagged, complex symbol, not Krell. Krell's symbology was brutal and geometric. This was fluid, almost biological. Vance studied the symbol. I don't recognize that sigil. What is it? The being, he needed a name for her, so he mentally settled on Ilara. The first soft sound that came to mind ignored his question. She pointed again, urgently at the symbol, then back at the main Krell structure above, and finally, she made a sweeping gesture across the room, encompassing the containment cell, the Krell war zone, everything. Then she brought her hands together, palms facing, and crushed them slowly into a fist. Finished. Crushed. Vance understood the gesture immediately. She was saying the Krell were finished. Destroyed. But her fear didn't match the confidence of that statement. He knelt down, his armor creaking. If the Krell are finished, why are you hiding here? Who are you? Ilara made a desperate, high-pitched whine. She knew she was failing to communicate. She scraped the metal shard across the floor again, drawing a rough 6-limbed shape. The Krell. She drew a line through it, signifying defeat. Then, next to the defeated Krell, she drew the jagged symbol again. This time she didn't crush it. She drew a series of radiating lines outward from the symbol, fast and precise, like energy pulses or vectors. She then pointed at the Krell drawing and then at herself. She made the gesture for captured or imprisoned. Finally, she pointed at the new, radiating symbol and then pointed at Vance, making a sharp, aggressive thrusting motion with her fist. The translation was unmistakable, even without a universal dictionary. They, the ones with the jagged symbol, imprisoned the Krell, and they, the jagged symbol, are coming for you. Vance felt a cold, deep dread settle in his stomach, worse than any fear the Krell had ever inspired. It wasn't the message itself, which sounded like the rambling of a traumatized captive. It was the absolute, visceral terror in her eyes when she drew that symbol. He stood up quickly. Reyes, I need a visual on the perimeter. Anything unusual? Just dust devils, Sarge, Reyes replied, sounding annoyed. And a lot of dead Krell. You finding the processors or not? Command is twitchy. Vance looked back at Ilara. She was watching him, her entire posture a plea. He couldn't dismiss her. Her knowledge was too specific. If she was a Krell plant, she was the worst actor in the galaxy. But if she was telling the truth, if the Krell were just the first wave, the distraction. I found something else, Vance said, keeping his voice carefully neutral for the comms log. A small non-Krell data cache, highly encrypted. I'm tagging it for deep analysis. It's going to take me a minute to secure it. He was lying to his corporal, which was a violation of standing orders, but he needed time. He needed to understand that symbol. He deactivated his external comms. He took off his helmet. The thin, metallic air hit his face, stinging his eyes, but it was necessary. She needed to see his face, to see the human beneath the armor. Ilara gasped, recognizing the gesture of vulnerability. "Show me again," Vance whispered, his voice hoarse. "Show me what they are!" Ilara scrambled back to the wall, her fear giving way to frantic urgency. She drew the six-limbed Krell again. Then she drew the jagged symbol. She then began drawing a schematic. It was crude, but the lines were precise, a diagram of the Krell's standard plasma rifle. Then she drew the jagged symbol next to it and modified the weapon. She added components, shifted the energy conduits, made subtle changes that, even to Vance's untrained eye, looked like improvements. Exponential improvements. She pointed at the Krell rifle and made a shaking gesture, weak, flawed. She pointed at the modified rifle and made a gesture of overwhelming, crushing power. Superior. "They supplied the Krell?" Vance asked, his mind racing through 3 months of bitter fighting. The Krell had always seemed just competent enough to be a threat, but never truly innovative. If someone else was feeding them tech. Ilara shook her head rapidly. No, not supplied. She erased the modified rifle. She drew the Krell. She drew the jagged symbol above them. Then she drew a single, thin line connecting the jagged symbol to the Krell's behavior. She mimed confusion, erratic movements, self-destructive tactics. "They controlled them?" Vance asked, the implication staggering. "The Krell weren't fighting us. They were being directed." Ilara nodded emphatically, a small, painful sound escaping her throat. She pointed to a recent battle site on the Krell map, a place where Vance's company had been ambushed and almost wiped out. It was a tactical blunder on the Krell's part, a perfect choke point, but executed too soon, too obviously. Vance had always assumed Krell arrogance. Ilara drew a finger across the map, showing the true, optimal flanking maneuver that the Krell should have used. Then she drew the jagged symbol next to the actual attack vector, the botched one. They threw the fight, Vance realized, the blood draining from his face. They sacrificed that battalion to draw us into a specific strategic location. A trap. Ilara nodded, her eyes filling with tears. She reached out a hesitant hand and touched the scarred metal wall. She then drew the jagged symbol one last time. Beneath it, she wrote a series of characters that were clearly numeric, but not in any base Vance recognized. She pointed at the numbers, then at the calendar embedded in Vance's wrist display. She was indicating a specific date, a date that was only 3 cycles away. The implications slammed into Vance like a kinetic round. They hadn't won the war. They had completed the first phase of an enemy's plan. They had spent their fleet, their resources, and their best soldiers neutralizing a proxy force, exactly as the real enemy intended. And in 3 cycles, the real enemy was coming to collect the prize, the strategically vital, resource-rich Karen Prime. Vance looked at the frail, terrified alien refugee. She was the only one who knew the truth, and she was trapped in a sub-level with a single human soldier who was legally obligated to report her as detained enemy intelligence. He had to get her out. He had to get her information to command. "Reyes," Vance said, reactivating his external comms, his voice now firm, authoritative. "I'm securing the data cache now. It's heavy, and the structural integrity down here is questionable. I need you to pull back 20 meters and set up a perimeter. I need silence. Absolute silence, Corporal. I'm running a decryption sequence, and any interference could fry the processors." "Roger that, Sarge. 20 meters and quiet," Reyes confirmed, though Vance could hear the doubt in her tone. Vance looked back at Ilara. She watched him, waiting for his decision. Her fate, and possibly the fate of the entire human fleet in this sector, resting on his next move. He pushed the rifle back into its magnetic holster on his thigh. He reached out a hand, not in threat, but in invitation. "We move now," he told her, speaking slowly in standard English, knowing she wouldn't understand the words, but understanding the intent. "You show me how to stop them." Velyra hesitated for only a second. She saw the commitment in his human eyes. She placed her thin, cold hand into his massive, armored one. Vance knew the risk. If he brought her up, Command would interrogate her, likely dismiss her story as tactical disinformation, and certainly lock her away. They were too invested in the narrative of Kael defeat to accept a deeper, more terrifying truth. He needed proof. He needed something tangible that only the Vex, the jagged symbol people, would leave behind. "Show me the trap," Vance commanded, pulling her gently toward the entrance to the tunnel. "Where is the core of their operation? Where did they direct the Kael from?" Velyra pointed not back toward the main facility, but deeper into the rock beneath the containment cell. There was another hatch, expertly concealed, that his senses hadn't even registered. She was leading him into the heart of the enemy's forgotten base. Vance secured his helmet back on. He adjusted his grip on the rifle. He was no longer on a cleanup mission. He was now running a black op, protecting an alien witness, and hunting a ghost enemy that his entire civilization didn't even know existed. He took a deep breath of the recycled air. The war was about to get a lot worse, and he was taking the first step into the true darkness, guided by a terrified refugee whose people had just manipulated humanity into a slaughterhouse. This wasn't about luck. This was about choice, and Vance had just chosen defiance. He followed Velyra into the narrow, dark passage, leaving the supposed victory of Karen Prime behind him. The real war, the one against the Vex, had just begun. The hidden hatch was flush with the rock, sealed by a mechanism that didn't rely on physical locking pins or magnetic clamps, but on a subtle distortion of the local gravity field. Vance didn't feel the shift, but his armor sensors screamed a warning about localized quantum interference. Velyra guided his hand to a specific point on the hatch. Her fingers, delicate and cold, traced a pattern that looked like a musical notation, not a code. When she pressed the final point, the hatch didn't slide or swing. It simply dissolved into shimmering, cold light, revealing a steep, narrow shaft plunging into the absolute dark. "Stay close," Vance muttered, switching his armor's optical systems to thermal and low-light amplification. The air in the shaft was different again. It was dry, sterile, and intensely cold, carrying no scent of dust or decay, a perfect vacuum, maintained for decades. They descended slowly, Vance using the magnetic clamps on his boots to walk down the vertical tunnel, Velyra clinging to the backplate of his armor, light as a ghost. This was not Kael construction. The Kael were crude engineers, prioritizing brute force and mass over elegance. This tunnel was seamless, the walls polished dark obsidian, absorbing all light. It felt like walking down the throat of something ancient and terrible. After maybe 50 meters, the shaft opened into a chamber. It wasn't large, perhaps 10 meters across, but the atmosphere here was heavy with latent energy. In the center, a single console stood, humming with a low rhythmic thrum. It wasn't lit by lamps, but by the soft, internal glow of its own components, a sickly green light that pulsed like a slow heartbeat. This was the nerve center. Velyra slid off Vance's back and scrambled toward the console, ignoring the pain in her injured leg. Her fear had been replaced by a fierce, focused determination. Vance swept the room with his rifle, but there were no conventional threats, no tripwires, no Kael guards, no plasma residue. The Vex didn't guard their secrets with muscle. They guarded them with obscurity and advanced technology. He approached the console, his armored boot scraping on the polished floor. The console's surface was not a screen or a keyboard, but a shallow, recessed pool of liquid metal that shifted constantly, displaying complex three-dimensional schematics. Ilara reached out and touched the liquid surface. The green light intensified, and the fluid metal solidified instantly beneath her touch, forming the jagged Vex symbol. She pointed at the symbol, then at the display. The display immediately zoomed out, showing a holographic projection of the entire Karan Prime system, complete with orbital deployment patterns and ground troop movements, human and Krell. The Krell forces were depicted in dull red, the human forces in bright blue, and then, overlaid on the entire strategic map, were thin, almost invisible golden lines originating from the Vex console, terminating at every major Krell command post. "Control vectors," Vance breathed, his voice tight. "Direct, real-time, tactical manipulation." Ilara nodded rapidly, her eyes wide. She manipulated the display, isolating a specific battle, the ambush that nearly wiped out Vance's company 2 weeks prior. On the screen, the red Krell markers began moving, following a perfectly logical flanking maneuver, the one Vance had identified as the correct move. Then, the golden Vex line pulsed, and the Krell markers jerked violently, abandoning the flank and charging straight into the prepared human kill zone. It was a demonstration of self-sabotage, orchestrated perfectly to inflict maximum damage on the humans while expending Krell assets. They hadn't been fighting to win. They had been fighting to lose, strategically. "They were farming us," Vance whispered, the realization a cold spike in his gut. "They let us spend our ammunition, our ships, our lives, clearing the sector for them." Ilara pointed at the console, then at Vance's wrist-mounted datapad. She was telling him he needed to extract the data. Vance knew military procedure would demand a physical sample, a data core, something Command couldn't dismiss as a corrupted transmission or a psychological attack. He unholstered a universal data spike, standard issue for interfacing with alien tech, though primarily designed for Krell hardware. "This might not work, Ilara. Their encryption." She shook her head and quickly drew a small, rough sketch on the floor next to the console, a diagram of the spike's head, showing the conventional data pins. Then, using the metal shard, she drew a single, almost invisible node on the Vex console. "Analog interface is blocked. Use the quantum tap." Vance recognized the concept. It was theoretical human tech, meant to siphon data from highly shielded systems without physical connection. He adjusted the spike, overriding the standard interface protocols, and pressed the tip to the designated node. The console reacted instantly. Instead of the usual flashing lights of a data transfer, the entire chamber went silent. The green light faded. Vance's armor systems registered the data influx. It wasn't a trickle. It was a flood. Gigabytes of encrypted tactical logs, Vex operational manifests, and, most critically, the full strategic timeline Ilara had warned him about. The 3-cycle countdown, data transfer complete, core secured. Just as the console's green light began to return to its normal rhythm, a high-pitched, almost subsonic whine echoed through the chamber. Vance's internal comms, though deactivated externally, picked up the vibration. Ilara froze, her pale skin turning a shade closer to white quartz. She pointed frantically at the ceiling. "What is it?" Vance demanded, raising his rifle. She didn't speak, but drew the jagged Vex symbol, and then drew a circle around it, followed by a series of tiny, precise legs. Automated defense. Vance didn't wait. He knew the Vex wouldn't leave a live command center without a cleanup protocol. He grabbed Ilara, pulling her behind the thickest part of the console. "Hold tight!" A section of the ceiling, previously seamless, detached with a soundless hiss. A drone descended. It wasn't a Krell brute. This thing was smaller than Vance's helmet, sleek and black. made of a material that seemed to absorb light. It moved with unnatural speed and precision, silent except for the faint, high whine of its propulsion system. Vance's targeting system locked onto it, but the drone was too fast, already calculating attack vectors. Threat assessment. High velocity. Unknown energy signature. The drone didn't use plasma or kinetic rounds. It fired a single thin beam of intense purple light. The beam struck the wall where Vance had been standing a second before. The obsidian didn't scorch or melt. It simply disintegrated, vaporized instantly into nothingness. "Disruptor beam," Vance grunted, scrambling sideways. That wasn't just energy. That was molecular destabilization. One hit, and his armor, and he, would be gone. He needed to hit it first, and he couldn't afford to miss. He rolled out from behind the console, targeting the drone's center mass. He fired a burst of armor-piercing depleted uranium rounds. The drone didn't dodge. It created a momentary, shimmering blue field, a localized energy shield, that deflected the rounds. They ricocheted off the polished walls with deafening cracks, tearing through the fine Vex metalwork. The drone immediately counterfired, aiming for Vance's head. Vance ducked. The disruptor beam, passing inches over his helmet, vaporizing a section of the ceiling above him. Dust and fine rock began to rain down. "Too durable," Vance muttered. He couldn't burn through that shield with conventional fire. He needed a weak point, or a distraction. Ilara knew. She was pressed against the console, her eyes darting between Vance and the drone. She pointed at the drone, then pointed at the console and made a sharp, downward chopping motion. Overload the system. Vance understood. If the console was tied to the local defense grid, overloading the main system might draw power or create a surge that would drop the drone's shield. He couldn't reach the console without exposing himself to the disruptor beam. "Get ready to run, Ilara," he ordered. He activated the fragmentation grenade launcher built into his rifle's underbarrel. He didn't aim at the drone. He aimed at the floor directly beneath the console. 1 second, he fired. The high-explosive grenade slammed into the obsidian floor. It wasn't designed to penetrate Vex materials, but the sheer kinetic force and concussive shockwave were enough. Kaboom! The chamber shuddered violently. The floor cracked, and the console, momentarily destabilized, flashed bright green, then dark. For a crucial half-second, the drone's blue shield flickered and vanished. Vance didn't hesitate. He switched his rifle to full auto and poured a concentrated stream of depleted uranium into the drone's exposed housing. The small machine shuddered, sparks flying, and then exploded in a silent puff of smoke and fine metallic dust, slamming into the far wall. The whine stopped. Silence returned, heavy and absolute, broken only by the sound of falling dust. Vance dropped the rifle barrel. He was breathing hard, the adrenaline spiking his heart rate. That drone was more dangerous than an entire Krell platoon. "We need to move, now." The explosion, even muffled by the rock, was a massive risk. Reyes was only 20 meters above them. Vance had claimed he was running a decryption sequence, which explained the delay, but not the sound of a fragmentation grenade. He snatched the data spike, which was still attached to his wrist by a lanyard. The core was secure. Ilara scrambled up, her face streaked with dust, the terror returning. She pointed back toward the ascent shaft, urging him upward. Vance grabbed her hand and pulled her along. They scrambled back up the vertical tunnel. As they reached the hidden hatch, Vance activated his external comms, preempting any query from Reyes. "Reyes, report," Vance said, his voice strained but controlled, projecting urgency and frustration. "Sarge, what the hell was that?" "It sounded like a structural collapse down there." Reyes's voice was sharp with alarm. "It was," Vance lied smoothly. "The Krell rigged a pressure charge beneath the console. Bad news, the data cache is destroyed. Good news, I managed to pull the core just before the charge detonated. It's unstable. We need to evacuate this sector immediately. Get ready to move out." Vance didn't mention Ilara. She was still technically detained enemy intelligence, and he couldn't risk command ordering her immediate termination or transfer to a black site. If her information was real, the fate of the sector hinged on keeping her safe and credible. He pulled Ilara through the hatch and sealed it behind them, melting the surface with a quick blast of superheated plasma from his gauntlet. The Vex command center was now buried beneath slagged metal and rock, hopefully hidden from human and Vex retrieval. They were back in the narrow, stale air maintenance tunnel. "We go out the way we came in," Vance instructed Ilara, pointing toward the main armory level. As they moved, Reyes's voice crackled back over the comms. "Sarge, Command just sent a priority broadcast. They've detected an anomaly." Vance stopped dead. "What kind of anomaly?" "Not sure, Sarge. They are calling it a deep space signature fluctuation. They're scrambling 2 destroyer groups from Sector Gamma, standard patrol. They say it's probably just solar flare distortion, but they're twitchy." Vance felt the cold dread return. 3 cycles. That was the Vex timeline. A deep space signature fluctuation wasn't solar flares. It was the Vex fleet moving into position. They were early, or perhaps the Krell defeat had accelerated their schedule. He looked down at Ilara. She was listening to his muffled comms, her eyes fixed on his. She knew. "We need to get to the extraction point, Reyes," Vance said, trying to keep the panic out of his voice. "We're moving fast. Secure the outer perimeter and prepare the shuttle for immediate ascent. No delays." "Understood, Sarge. But wait. I'm picking up 2 thermal signatures moving toward your position, Sarge. Not Krell. Small, fast, human-sized. They look like cleanup crew, maybe scavengers, but they're moving with discipline." Vance's mind immediately screamed Vex. The drone failure would have triggered a backup response. "Negative, Reyes." Vance lied again, his heart pounding. "That's just me and the data core. I need absolute priority extraction. If I lose this data, 3 months of fighting were for nothing. Move!" He pushed Ilara ahead of him, urging her toward the exit hatch leading into the main armory. "Sarge," Reyes insisted, her voice tight with confusion. "There are 2 distinct signatures. One is massive, your armor. The other is small, frail. It's moving like it's injured." Vance was exposed. Reyes had seen the second signature on her thermal scanner. He reached the hatch. He had 2 choices: blast through Reyes or trust her. Reyes was disciplined, but she was loyal to command first. He looked at Ilara, whose face was a mask of fear, knowing they were about to be caught. Vance took a deep breath. He had already violated protocol by protecting the witness. Now he had to compound the violation by bringing her into the light, banking everything on the slim chance that Reyes's loyalty to him, personally, was stronger than her training. He cycled the magnetic seals on the hatch. "Reyes, open fire on anything that comes through that hatch after I do," Vance commanded, his voice a low, terrifying growl. "And Reyes, look at me. This is not a drill. This is the difference between survival and extinction. I found the truth, Corporal, and it is worse than the Krell." He kicked the hatch open and stepped into the main armory corridor, his massive armor filling the doorway. Reyes was 20 meters away, her own power armor braced, her heavy repeater rifle aimed directly at the opening. She saw him, and then she saw Ilara, small, blue-gray, and clearly alien, huddled behind his armored leg. Reyes's targeting reticle immediately flashed red. Unknown combatant. Engage. "Sarge, what in the hell is that?" Reyes demanded, her voice shaking with disbelief and shock. "That is the witness, Reyes," Vance said, stepping fully into the corridor. "She is the only reason we are still alive. She knows who is really running this war. We don't have time for this. We have Vex assets closing fast." He pointed his rifle at the hatch he had just exited. "If you see anything that looks like a small black drone, or anything that isn't human, vaporize it. But you do not touch her. That is a direct order, Corporal. Reyes lowered her rifle only slightly, her entire body language radiating confusion and mistrust. Vance knew he had maybe 5 seconds before she overrode his direct command for the sake of standard operating procedure. Sarge, I have to report this, Reyes insisted. An unknown alien species in a restricted combat zone. You report this, and we all die, Reyes, Vance snapped. The Krell were a puppet show. This refugee has the intelligence that proves it. We need to get her and the data core to the extraction shuttle now. Before Reyes could reply, the metal corridor behind Vance groaned. The Vex cleanup crew had arrived at the outer hatch. 2 figures, slender and fast, wearing lightweight pressurized suits of the same light-absorbing black material as the drone, stepped into the armory sub-level. They were smaller than humans, moving with an eerie, insectile grace. They carried rifles that hummed with the same purple energy as the drone's disruptor beam. They weren't Krell. They were the Vex. They saw Ilara and Vance, their weapons raised instantly. "Contact!" Vance yelled. He didn't wait for Reyes. He fired a 3-round burst at the first Vex, forcing him to duck behind a slagged support beam. Reyes, trained to respond to immediate threat, reacted on instinct. She opened fire on the second Vex, her heavy repeater spewing massive kinetic rounds. The Vex alien, faster than any Krell, dodged the first 2 rounds, but the third caught him in the shoulder. The impact didn't kill him, but it sent him spinning violently into the wall. "They're not Krell, Sarge!" Reyes screamed, her voice horrified. "They're too fast!" "I know! Get to the shuttle! I'll cover the rear!" Vance shoved Ilara toward Reyes. "Protect her, Corporal. She is the priority." Reyes, faced with a clear, immediate threat that validated Vance's panic, finally prioritized the action over the protocol. She dropped her rifle and scooped Ilara up, holding the frail alien tight against her massive armor. "Moving! ETA extraction point, 3 minutes!" Vance turned back to face the Vex. One was recovering, the other was emerging from behind the beam, his disruptor rifle charging. Vance knew he couldn't win a sustained firefight against that kind of technology. He was trading mass for speed, and his armor was a massive target. He pulled a thermal charge from his belt, a demolition device meant to melt through Krell bunkers. He armed the charge for a 5-second delay and threw it deep into the armory sub-level. "See you in hell, ghosts," Vance growled, turning and sprinting down the corridor after Reyes. He heard the Vex alien scream a soundless, high-frequency command. They were fast, but the charge was faster. Vance didn't look back. He ran. He heard the muffled, concussive thump of the thermal charge detonating behind him, followed by the sound of stressed metal ripping apart. That section of the armory was now sealed, crushed by localized heat and pressure. They burst out of the facility and into the cold, thin atmosphere of Karan Prime. The extraction shuttle was 50 meters away, its ramp already cycling down. Reyes reached the ramp first, climbing aboard with Ilara clutched securely. Vance paused at the base of the ramp, scanning the desolate, ruined landscape. The deep space signature fluctuation was no longer a theory. He could feel it, a wrongness in the gravitational pull, a subtle hum in the atmosphere. The Vex were coming. He climbed the ramp just as the pilot, a young man named Lieutenant Chen, slammed the controls. "Sarge, what the hell happened down there? Command is redlining my comms," Chen yelled over the whine of the engines. "Tell Command we found what we were looking for, Lieutenant," Vance said, sealing his helmet and securing the data core to his chest plate. He looked at Ilara, huddled in Reyes's arms, shivering, but alive. "And tell them the Krell weren't the enemy. They were the bait." The shuttle lifted off, blasting plumes of dust and debris into the cold sky. They had the witness and the proof, but they were still trapped in the Krell sector, flying straight toward a fleet that still believed the war was over. The hard part, convincing Command, was about to begin. And Vance knew, with chilling certainty, that the Vex wouldn't let their secret escape the planet alive. The extraction shuttle, a small pressurized coffin named the Dust Devil, screamed upward, fighting Karen Prime's heavy gravity. Lieutenant Chen pushed the engines past their safety limit. The noise inside the cabin was deafening, a mix of raw thrust and the high-pitched squeal of stressed metal. Vance stood braced against the bulkhead, his massive form shielding Elara and Reyes, who were strapped into the rear seats. He could hear the frantic chatter on the command frequency, demanding explanations for the structural collapse and the unauthorized departure. He ignored them. "Chen, status on pursuit?" Vance demanded over the internal comms, his voice cutting through the engine noise. "Negative visual, Sarge, but my long-range thermal is picking up multiple fast contacts launching from the surface. Small. Too small for Krell fighters. They're closing fast, moving like guided missiles. Vex interceptors, silent, sleek, and armed with molecular disruptors. They weren't designed for dogfights. They were designed for assassination." "They know we have the data," Vance grunted. "They're not going to risk a large-scale engagement that alerts our fleet. They want to vaporize us before we can transmit." Elara, shivering in Reyes's grip, pointed frantically at the main viewport, then at the data core strapped to Vance's chest. She made the crushing fist gesture, then pointed out again. "They will destroy the data." "Reyes, keep her calm. Chen, we are not running for the jump point yet. We need a distraction. Where is the largest concentration of Krell orbital wreckage?" Chen checked the nav display, his face pale. "Sector 4 Delta, Sarge. The old Krell orbital defense network. Command hit it with fusion lances. It's just a graveyard of scrap metal and dormant power cores, maybe 50 kilometers from here. Fly us into the middle of it, maximum speed." "Sarge, that's a debris field. It'll tear us apart." "We'll be torn apart anyway if those Vex interceptors catch us," Vance retorted, pulling the data core off his chest. "The Vex spent months manipulating the Krell. They implanted command frequencies, behavioral overrides. They wouldn't leave that tech dormant where we could find it." Vance began manipulating the data core, overriding the encryption protocols he had just downloaded. He needed to find the tactical control frequency, the golden line Elara had shown him on the Vex console. "I'm going to use the Vex's own command signal to wake up the Krell ghosts," Vance explained to Chen. "The Vex interceptors are programmed to eliminate loose ends and maintain secrecy. If they see dormant Krell defenses suddenly reactivate, they will break off their attack on us to sanitize their own mess." He found the frequency, a tight, high-band pulse that was pure Vex. He routed it through the Dust Devil's main comms array, turning their small shuttle into a massive, localized broadcast beacon. 5 seconds to detonation, Chen. Get ready to turn hard." The Dust Devil plunged into the debris field. Chunks of slagged Krell metal, the size of trucks, scraped against the hull, sending painful vibrations through Vance's armor. "Sarge, they're right behind us," Chen yelled. The proximity alarm was screaming. Vance hit the broadcast button. The Vex signal flooded the debris field. It wasn't a complex command, just a raw, aggressive activation signal. For a terrifying, heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, 50 meters off their port side, a massive half-melted Krell destroyer engine core, previously inert, flared violently. Its remaining turret, designed to track orbital targets, began to slew wildly, powered by residual energy reserves suddenly kicked back into life. The Vex interceptors, 3 sleek black shapes that had just been lining up their disruptor shots, immediately broke formation. Their primary mission, maintaining the illusion of Krell defeat, overrode the secondary mission of eliminating the witness. They couldn't allow a dormant Krell weapon system to fire indiscriminately and alert the entire human fleet. They engaged the activated Krell turret. 3 rapid, silent purple beams struck the massive Krell core. The core didn't explode, it imploded, vaporized into nothingness. "They took the bait," Vance roared. "Chen, jump, now." Chen didn't need to be told twice. He executed a brutal, instantaneous jump sequence, slamming the shuttle into faster-than-light travel. The G-forces pressed Vance into the bulkhead. 1 second they were in the debris field. The next, they were in the sterile, empty void of deep space, several light minutes away from Karen Prime. Vance checked the data core. Secure. He looked at Alara. She was panting, but gave him a weak nod. They had survived the first layer of the trap. The journey to the Aegis, the human flagship and command center for the sector, was short but tense. Vance spent the time preparing his defense. He was bringing an unauthorized alien onto a flagship and had committed multiple acts of insubordination and lied to his corporal. He was facing a court-martial, possibly treason charges, but he had the proof. The Dust Devil docked with the Aegis's massive hangar bay. The moment the ramp dropped, they were met by a full squad of security troops in pristine white armor, led by Lieutenant Commander Pierce, the Admiral's cold, efficient aide. Pierce's eyes immediately fixed on Alara, still clutched in Reyes's arms. "Sergeant Vance," Pierce's voice was arctic. "You are relieved of command immediately. Stand down and surrender the data core. And that creature—" "I will surrender the data core only to Admiral Thorne, Commander." Vance cut him off, stepping forward. His armor was scarred, covered in dust, and radiated raw authority. "This is a level Omega threat. The information on this core supersedes every protocol you are currently operating under." Pierce hesitated. Vance's reputation, earned in 3 months of brutal ground fighting, still carried weight. "The creature is a detainee, Sergeant," Pierce insisted. "It goes to quarantine immediately." "Negative," Vance stated, planting his feet. "This is Alara. She is a refugee, and the sole witness to the Vex operation. She stays with me until the Admiral has been briefed." Vance knew the name Vex meant nothing to Pierce. He was still processing the alien refugee. A heavy silence settled. Then, a voice boomed over the comms system, overriding Pierce's channel. "Vance, I don't know what you think you're pulling, but you will come directly to my bridge. And you will bring that data core. Now." It was Admiral Thorne, his voice thick with fury. The bridge of the Aegis was a cathedral of light and information, all holographic displays and soft blue ambient lighting. Admiral Thorne, a man whose career was built on strategic victories against the Krell, stood rigid at the central command station. Vance entered, followed by Reyes, still holding Alara, who seemed overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the human ship. "Sergeant Vance," Thorne began, his eyes burning with controlled rage. "You defied direct orders, lied to your corporal, caused a structural collapse, and brought an unauthorized, non-human life form onto my flagship. You are currently facing charges that could see you executed." Vance ignored the threat. He walked directly to the tactical display table and slammed the data core onto the polished surface. "Admiral, the Krell War is over, because we won it exactly according to the schedule set by the Vex." Thorne stared at him, then at Alara. "Vex? What in the hell is a Vex?" "They are the architects of this war, sir. The Krell were their proxy. They fed them technology, manipulated their tactics, and used them to bleed our fleet dry while we secured Karen Prime, a planet they clearly want for themselves." Thorne scoffed. "Sergeant, you sound like a lunatic. We just pulverized the Krell's entire logistics chain. Karen Prime is ours." "It's a trap, Admiral. This core contains the full operational timeline. The Vex fleet is inbound. They planned for us to be exhausted, complacent, and celebrating victory exactly 3 cycles from now." Thorne nodded to his chief of analysis. "Run the core, now." The analysis team, already alerted to the urgency, swarmed the data core. The bridge went silent, save for the rhythmic beeping of the system analyzing the deeply encrypted Vex data. Reyes, meanwhile, had unstrapped Alara and was holding her gently. Alara looked at Thorne, then pointed at the data table and made the jagged Vex symbol in the air. Thorn watched the alien in disbelief. "Sir, we have initial decryption," the chief of analysis reported, his voice tight. "The data structure is unlike anything we've seen. It's quantum entangled, but we're forcing the sync." Seconds stretched into minutes. The fate of the entire sector hung on the speed of the Aegis's processors. Suddenly, alarms began to blare across the bridge. Not internal alarms, but deep space sensor alerts. "Admiral, Sector Gamma is reporting a massive signature fluctuation," the communications officer yelled. "It's not solar distortion. It's consistent with multiple fleet jumps, mass displacement signatures." Thorn slammed his fist on the console. "How many ships?" "Too many to count, sir. They're still compiling the signature profile, but it is not Krell. The energy signature is completely alien, highly efficient, and fast." Vance pointed at the data core, which had just flashed green, indicating a successful decryption. "The timeline, Admiral. Check the timeline." The chief of analysis, his face white, looked up from the display. "Sir, the core is confirmed Vex operational manifests. They call themselves the Vex Ascendancy and the Strategic Timeline. The predicted arrival of their main fleet component is..." He paused, swallowing hard. "Is in exactly 74 hours, Admiral. 3 cycles." A collective gasp went through the bridge crew. The Krell War had taken 3 months. The Vex were arriving in 3 days. Thorn didn't look at Vance. He looked at Alara, the small, frail alien refugee who had risked everything to deliver the truth. "The Krell were bait," Thorn whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "We spent everything defeating a shadow." He spun around, his fury replaced by cold, desperate focus. "All hands, battle stations. Red alert across the sector. Initiate Sector 7 contingency protocols. We are not going to be caught celebrating." The bridge erupted into controlled chaos. Orders were barked, defensive parameters were set, and the massive human fleet, complacent just moments ago, began to scramble its assets. Thorn turned back to Vance, his face etched with exhaustion and respect. "Sergeant Vance," Thorn said, his voice low, "you saved us. Your actions, though in violation of every regulation, have given us the warning we needed." He paused, then nodded to Pierce. "Lieutenant Commander, detain the sergeant. Standard protocol for insubordination and treason until the immediate threat is neutralized. But treat him with respect. He is a hero." Vance accepted the cuffs, the cold metal clicking around his wrists. He knew the cost of his choice. He had chosen survival over protocol, and now he would pay the price. "Admiral," Vance said, his eyes meeting Thorn's, "the Vex are masters of deception. They will expect us to defend Karen Prime. Do not give them the fight they want." Thorn studied the tactical display, already calculating. "We have 74 hours to reposition the fleet and set a trap of our own. We will give them a warm welcome, Sergeant." Vance nodded. He looked at Alara one last time. She was watching him, her big eyes reflecting the blue light of the bridge. She reached out and touched Reyes's hand in a gesture of shared understanding. "One more thing, Admiral," Vance added, as Pierce began to escort him away. "The Vex won't stop at Karen Prime. This is just the opening move. They are coming for us all." Vance sat in the brig, the cold, sterile silence a stark contrast to the chaos he had just left behind. He was alone, but not defeated. 72 hours later, the Vex Ascendancy fleet jumped into the Karen Prime system. They expected to find a shattered, celebrating human fleet, easy prey after a costly victory. They expected to find an exhausted enemy defending the resource-rich planet they had just claimed. Instead, they found a void. The human fleet was gone. Admiral Thorn, acting on Vance's advice and the Vex tactical data, had pulled the entire fleet back to the nearby Solarian Nebula, a massive, electromagnetically turbulent region where the advanced Vex sensors and disruptor weapons would be severely hampered. The Vex landed on Charon Prime, claiming their prize. But as their ground troops began establishing their operational base, the human fleet emerged from the nebula, not scattered and exhausted, but concentrated, disciplined, and launching a coordinated counterattack into the Vex's logistical flanks. The Vex had planned for a slaughter. They received a war. The battle for the sector raged for weeks, a grinding, brutal conflict fought on terms humanity hadn't even known existed until a few days prior. The humans were outmatched in technology, but they fought with the ferocity of a species that had nearly been tricked into extinction. They held the line. They fought with the data Vance had stolen, exploiting every Vex weakness Ilara had revealed. In the end, humanity didn't win by superior firepower or luck. They won because one soldier chose to believe a terrified refugee, defied his entire command structure, and secured the truth at the cost of his own freedom. The Vex ascendancy, reeling from the unexpected disciplined resistance, retreated to regroup. Charon Prime remained in Vex hands, a strategic loss, but the human fleet survived, intact, and ready for the next phase of the real war. Weeks after the Vex retreat, Vance was brought before a closed military tribunal. The charges were read: insubordination, unauthorized contact with alien species, and endangering military assets. Admiral Thorne testified. He detailed every violation, every risk Vance took. Then, he detailed the data Vance had brought back, the confirmed Vex timeline, and the resulting success of the Solarian maneuver. The tribunal found Sergeant Elias Vance guilty on all counts of insubordination. He was stripped of his rank and sentenced to 10 years confinement. But as the Judge Advocate General read the sentence, he added a final, unprecedented codicil. However, in light of the extraordinary and life-saving nature of the intelligence secured, and the undeniable fact that the defendant's calculated defiance resulted in the preservation of the entire sector fleet, the remainder of the sentence is hereby suspended. Elias Vance is released immediately, with a full honorable discharge and a commendation for services rendered above and beyond the call of duty. Vance walked out a free man, stripped of his rank, but wearing the only medal that mattered: the knowledge that when the darkness came, he had chosen the hard path, the human path, and saved them all. The war with the Vex had begun. And this time, humanity was ready.